Hi, everyone. My name's John Balbus, and it's a real pleasure to be with you here today. I want to start by thanking Dr. Regine Dutard in the Office of Research on Women's Health of NIH for inviting me to give this talk to you on women's environment and health. I approach this talk with a lot of gratitude, but also trepidation as a white male trying to convey the realities of people caught in harm's way by virtue of their gender, as so many are also caught in harm's way by virtue of the color of their skin. So I hope that I'm able to convey both the science and also these perspectives to you with meaning and without bias. Here's the outline for my talk today. I'm going to focus the discussion on three types of environmental exposures: endocrine disrupting chemicals, air pollution, and climate change. But before I get into those, I want to start at the very beginning based on the picture that you see there. I want to start with the creation of the world, in fact, and honor the many cultures whose creation stories attribute our very existence to women. This is an image of Sky Woman falling from the Huron creation story that tells of how Sky Woman fell through a rip in the sky and was caught before falling into the watery surface of the planet by birds. Sky Woman then created land on the back of a turtle. According to that story, the creation of land required two things. It required the sacrifices of all of the animals that she came to see when she landed, and it also came about because of Sky Woman's dance that brought the world into existence. And so our timeline begins with the story of the first woman in harmony with the planet and the environment. Our timeline jumps to about 110 years ago, 1911, and it picks up the story of women out of harmony and in harm's way, in fact, from their environment. I've chosen the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire, and this is a very, I'm an occupational physician by training, and this was a very momentous event in the history of occupational health. Shirtwaists were the words that were used for women's blouses at the time. I've chosen this factory fire because it illustrates this duality. It was a tragedy of huge proportions, the culmination of years of horrific working conditions in a garment factory, the exploitation of immigrant women, in this case mostly women from Eastern Europe, and nearly 150 preventable deaths were caused when a fire started and the women were unable to escape because the owners had locked the fire exits. And so it's an illustration of how harmful exposures are often associated with disadvantage and exploitation, how physical stressors are often associated with psychosocial stressors. And then on the flip side, it's also the story of how women organizing to challenge the status quo and joining labor unions were ultimately able to galvanize International Women's Day in response to this tragedy. In 1962, biologist Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, identifying DDT and other persistent pesticides as harmful chemicals and hugely raising awareness of environmental toxicity. In 1976, an explosion near Seveso, Italy, led to massive community exposure to the chemical dioxin. Awareness of the potential risks coming from such an explosion led to a similarly massive study. The scientists in that area were able to collect a lot of blood samples, and they set up a cohort study that's now been in operation for nearly 40 years. And this study is one of the key mark studies to document both the role of endocrine disrupting chemicals in the health of women and then the children that they bear, as well as the nature of multi-generational inheritance of environmental toxicity. The 1980s saw the expanded use of a large number of chemicals with unique properties of persistence and also the ability to mimic endocrine hormones. These chemicals, such as Teflon and Gore-Tex, found their way into nearly every product in our homes, from the coating of our furniture to its stuffing, to the food the food packaging we used, and even our cookware. In the same decade, researchers noting earlier and earlier age at menarche and declining sperm counts in men started raising questions about whether these persistent chemicals could be starting to alter the endocrine and reproductive systems in humans. In the 1990s, the news stories shifted from humans to amphibians and reptiles, as frogs and alligators found striking malformations, like the one in this picture. These malformations were ultimately linked to endocrine-disrupting chemicals released into waterways in the ambient environment. The 2000s saw an expansion in the scientific activities around endocrine-disrupting chemicals and reproductive health. Researchers documented that adult diseases could be associated with environmental exposures early in life and even exposures to previous generations. This led to something called the DOHAD hypothesis, or the developmental origins of health and disease, which now informs environmental awareness in the realms of maternal-child health and environmental health more broadly. And the 2000s also saw the expansion of the CDC's biomonitoring program, looking for hundreds of chemicals in the blood of Americans, and unfortunately finding them in men, women, and children very frequently, in some cases surprisingly frequently. And then lastly, I highlight the recognition of the importance of gender for understanding the impacts of and also combating the effects of climate change and environmental challenges more broadly. And I picked the date of 2014. This is a hallmark date in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which monitors the global response to climate change, when it adopted something called the Lima Work Program on Gender, which requires that all countries take a gendered perspective and look at the role of gender in the impacts of climate change and also the solution space. So the story of endocrine disrupting chemicals starts with diethylstilbestrol, or DES, to which millions of women were exposed prior to the mid-1960s in the United States, in Europe, and also in Australia. While thalidomide awakened physicians and scientists to the reality that fetuses are not quote-unquote perfect parasites protected completely by the placenta, but instead are actually vulnerable to chemical insults. You'll recall that thalidomide led to an epidemic of birth defects in the children of women who had used that. It was the DES catastrophe that unfolded in the 1960s and 70s that brought greater awareness to the phenomenon of endocrine disruption and the multi-generational impacts of in utero exposure to female children in particular. Beyond the sentinel finding of clear cell vaginal adenocarcinoma, children of DES-treated mothers suffered a wide range of other structural changes and reproductive problems. And yet, despite this awareness, DES was still given to livestock as a feed additive until 1979. You'll remember that the timeline I showed mentioned biomonitoring, and here is just one graph demonstrating how widespread exposures were. This graph is from 2004, and in this case it's showing a population of pregnant women. I mentioned some of these findings were kind of surprising, and this would be one of them. The chemicals that are represented by those blue, orange, green, and purple bars all have endocrine disrupting potential. They're chemicals like organochlorine pesticides, brominated flame retardants, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and phthalates, and perfluorinated alkyl substances, or PFAS. And you can see even the least exposed woman, represented by that bar at the far left of this graph, has well over 25 of these chemicals in her body. And even the most exposed woman in this set doesn't have that many more. So the exposures to these chemicals were common, multiple, and pretty universal. Most endocrine disrupting chemicals have chemical structures that are very similar to the body's own hormones. And this slide shows the many different mechanisms by which they can disrupt normal function. By mimicking sex hormones, these chemicals can either stimulate or block hormone receptors, change a cell's signaling mechanisms, which leads to downstream kind of effects, and in some cases even cause changes to the expression of DNA through something called epigenetic alterations. And epigenetic alterations are things like the methylation of the DNA molecule, which affects its expression, and also changes to the histone structures. And the histones are proteins that help to coil up or unravel the DNA and help to control its expression as well. And these epigenetic mechanisms can actually, these changes to the methylation or the histones can be inherited, and they're one of the ways that these exposures can propagate health effects across multiple generations. And this illustration illustrates the kind of transgenerational effects in a more visual way. Because the immature oocytes in a female fetus, which you can see there on that right picture, because those oocytes will ultimately become the mature oocytes when that fetus is born and becomes a woman of reproductive age, and then ultimately become that woman's child, any direct effects on those oocytes by chemicals that occur in utero can manifest in the grandchild of the exposed pregnant woman. And so the grandmother to grandchild effect can be a direct effect of chemicals on the cells within that fetus. In order to reach the great-grandchild, or what's labeled as the F3 generation, there has to be some kind of heritable change, such as the kind of changes I was just mentioned and that are being increasingly understood through studying the epigenetic alterations I just mentioned. Most of the effects of DES that we've been talking about were observed through the F2 generation, or through the grandchild. But as the F3 generation is born, grows, and matures, further study it may find more effects being inherited in this fashion. And this table illustrates the multiplicity of effects of endocrine disrupting chemicals, and the fact that different chemicals can cause slightly different responses from endocrine systems, or in some cases, contrary responses, making predictions of how mixtures and cumulative exposures will affect women and children very complicated. So, for example, low molecular weight phthalates, the low MWP on this table, can lead to earlier growth spurts, while high molecular weight phthalates have been shown to delay growth. This complexity and mixture of effects, especially combined with the multiple exposures that we've shown, makes it difficult to detect a signal, to detect population-level changes in reproductive health or other kinds of health impacts. But understanding that on an individual basis, these chemicals can have potentially serious consequences for reproductive and overall health is leading to efforts to reduce exposures to all endocrine disruptors through a variety of regulatory mechanisms. I'd like to move on now to considering air pollution in women's health. While we've known for many years that air pollution causes exacerbation of lung diseases like asthma and COPD, can cause heart disease and heart attacks and premature death for both sexes, more recent research has highlighted the impacts of prenatal exposure to air pollution on the developing brain and other organs, as well as documenting adverse neurological impacts on women towards the end of life. And this illustration shows some of the mechanisms by which air pollution affects the brain, as well as some of its other effects. This includes, and on the right there, you can see there's a number 1 that shows direct transport of oxidizing air pollutants that may deposit in the nasal passages and get transported directly to the brain via the olfactory nerves. The second is the stimulation of inflammation cascades and transport of inflammatory cytokines from the lungs, where those particles can deposit, through the blood circulation to harm the blood vessels, but also get into the brain by that mechanism. And then the third mechanism that's shown here is alterations of the gut microbiome. Recent research is showing that air pollution can alter the gut microbiome, and we're learning more and more how the gut microbiome interacts with the brain and can cause changes in brain function and structure as well. And then you can see in the effects there that fine particulate matter, or PM2.5, has also recently been shown to directly affect women's fecundity, lowering ovarian reserve in new studies. So a wide range of health effects for men, women, and children, but some of them unique to women's situation. And there's another aspect that's unique to women's situation, which is the fact that women are predominantly exposed to household air pollution. This is a problem of global scale, and it's related to the indoor combustion of biofuels for cooking and heating among the world's poorest populations. Because most cultures place women in the roles of caretaker, fuel gatherer, and chief cook, women and their children are the most exposed to household air pollution, leading to an enormous toll of lung diseases and infections, heart and brain diseases, and premature death. And you can see the quote there from Dr. Flavia Bustreo, who was the Assistant Director General of the WHO, confirming that for women in low and middle income countries, household air pollution is the single leading environmental health risk. And so as we consider both endocrine disrupting chemicals and air pollution and the effects throughout different life stages, the need to capture, as well as we possibly can, the totality of these exposures, all of these exposures throughout the life course for research purposes starts to become clear. A scientist named Christopher Wilde coined the term exposome 15 to 20 years ago to convey the same comprehensive approach to understand environmental exposures that researchers were using when they talked about the genome, that OME, genome, to convey the sense of the entire structure of our DNA. This diagram just shows how measurements of maternal and placental chemicals can be used to capture the exposome of the developing child. But the exposome, very importantly, is more than just chemicals and air pollutants. While I don't have time to go into all of these exposures, we know that many other environmental factors, from aspects of our built environments like walkability and green space, to lifestyles and behaviors, to the social and political environment that leads to stress and constrained mobility, all of these can have enormous impacts on our health, both physical and mental. And importantly, this slide also shows that other aspects of our environment, including extreme weather events and prolonged climate abnormalities associated with climate change, also have profound effects on the health of all of us. This slide about the impacts of climate change on human health illustrates the many different pathways and consequent health outcomes by which climate change affects our health and well-being. For each of these pathways, women may have unique exposures, susceptibilities, and risks. I'll go into a bit more detail on just two of these pathways in a moment. First, I just want to highlight the fact that when we try to understand the impacts of climate change on, especially from a gendered perspective, we must take into account contexts of these climate change exposures. These include things like co-exposures to air pollution and other chemicals. It includes the constraints on men and women by poverty, often putting them poverty, lack of education, discrimination, and other socioeconomic factors which may lead to disproportionate exposures to a wide variety of environmental risks. And then all broader context of governance, land use, and urban or rural infrastructure, among other factors. All of these contexts influence whether or not an individual gets exposed, whether or not they have a harmful health effect from being exposed, and whether or not they're able to access care or otherwise be able to be resilient to those risks. And so this table, which is adapted from a paper written with colleagues from the University of Colorado in the United Kingdom, illustrates some of these factors from a women's health perspective. Women may experience unique or disproportionate health risks from extreme heat or climate-related disasters for several reasons. Some reasons have to do with biological factors that heighten risk, like a higher working metabolic rate or reduced ability to sweat and cool makes women, in some cases, more susceptible to adverse consequences of heat exposure. But other reasons have to do with political or cultural factors and discrimination. Recognition of the importance of these factors for women's health is a part of the drive by the global organizations combating climate change and its effects, to force this gendered perspective and to address the impacts on women separately and comprehensively. For example, HIV/AIDS is not generally thought of as being a climate-sensitive disease, and yet a shared perspective illustrates the connections between climate change, drought, population displacement, and the vulnerability of young women to HIV, as the story about this study that was published in PLOS Medicine demonstrates. And so, having focused most of my talk about the unique risks women face to their health from environmental exposures, I'd like to be returning to the start and to honoring women's contributions to bringing human society into greater harmony with our planet and environment. And I start with this quote from Vandana Shiva, a leading thinker in the role of women in sustainability. And you can see she says that we're either going to have a future where women lead the way to make peace with the earth, or we're not going to have a human future at all. Next, I want to recognize the continued role of women organizing, as they did after the Triangle Shirtwaist fire, to affect change. And this includes groups in the United States, like the Moms Clean Air Force and Silent Spring Institute, which, in the case of the Clean Air Force, obviously deals with air pollution. The Silent Spring Institute focuses its work on the endocrine disrupting chemicals, as well as global groups like the Women's Earth Alliance and the Women's Environment and Development Organization. And I want to also recognize some of the great individual women leaders in environmental health issues. That's Rachel Carson, who published Silent Spring. Next to her is Christiana Figueres, who was the lead of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, helping to address the impacts of climate change and reduce them. In the middle is Grope, who wrote one of the first Sentinel reports on sustainability with her commission, and who later became the head of the World Health Organization and worked on women's health issues. Next to her is Gina McCarthy, who was a leading advocate for health as the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. And then to the right is the next generation, Greta Thunberg, who is clearly a woman providing leadership in the environmental arena. Finally, I want to acknowledge the enormous importance of women's empowerment more broadly in solving the climate crisis. Project Drawdown, which analyzed the top 100 measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, has concluded that two aspects of women's empowerment, family planning and educating girls, if you combine them, they become the single greatest step that can be taken to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so we come full circle. As a woman's dance created a livable world for humans, the uplifting of women around the world is essential to the survival of humans on the planet. I hope this talk has raised your awareness and spurred many new thoughts on the connections between our environment and women's health. And I thank you for your attention.